Hi, everyone. I'm Patricia Shampton, Director of Alumni Relations for the Texas Exes, and welcome to the September Lunchtime Lecture, which is called Texas in the World of the Maya, Archaeology and Field Experiences. Before we get started, I just want to say a great big thank you to all of you who donated to the Texas Exes when you registered for this event. Your generosity will help us do more of this valuable programming, so thank you a lot for your support. And our guest today is Professor Fred Valdez, Jr. He is going to show us how the world of Maya archaeology is filled with discoveries and adventures. Professor Valdez is in the Department of Anthropology at UT Austin and serves as the director of both the Texas Archaeological Research Lab and the Program for Belize Archaeological Project in Northwest Belize. His research includes investigations of social political developments among pre-Maya through post-classic Maya, studies of material culture, and human and environment interplay. He is a recognized national and international scholar with numerous publications and presentations. We're delighted and honored to have him here to share his knowledge on this fascinating topic. Please welcome Professor Valdez, Jr.
Thank you very much for that, Patricia. Appreciate it. Thank you all for being here. The presentation today has lots of slides, lots of photos to look at. I'm going to go rather quickly through those, I hope. It's in three significant segments having to do with my particular research and experience in the Maya world. I'm going to start with a place called Rio Azul in Guatemala and then work over into the Belize side. I'll show a map concerning that in a minute, and then end with a place that where I originally started but have come back to in the last few years. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, so here's a general map of what's known as Mesoamerica, and the orange there that you see is the Maya region. I hope my arrow works here. So the country of Guatemala and Belize abut here, they share a border. Much of what I'm going to speak about is this northeastern corner of Guatemala and northern Belize. Next slide, please. So again, Hatchard is the more recent project, the Program for Belize Archaeological Project. We had an original project in northeastern Guatemala, another project in this area called Colha, and I'll show slides for each of these locations here momentarily. Next slide, please. So this is what lots of our areas look like in terms of places that are still forested. Sort of cutting through jungles or reopening what are known as lumber roads or jungle roads and making our way through. Trees have these huge roots above them, in part because of the environment where you have shallow soils, and as a result, the roots are up on top, taking advantage of what they can, but because the roots are up on top with heavy rains and winds, we get lots of tree falls, etc. So this is part of what that environment is like that we work in. Next slide, please. This was our original camp at Rio Azul, just a handful of us. The pole and thatch building in the back is our dining hall, cooking area, and so forth. We stayed primarily in tents and had daily meetings in this way. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. So one of the biggest finds from this particular project was the excavation of several tombs. The site had been heavily looted. And in this particular tomb on the lower right, you see a vessel that's known as the chocolate pot. It has a series of glyphs on it. And those glyphs were interpreted to read that the vessel was made to contain chocolate. The vessel had residue within it. We collected that residue. It was sent off to the food chemists at the Hershey Corporation, who know a little bit about chocolate. And they validated that indeed this was a vessel that contained chocolate. It pushed the known use of chocolate by the Maya back to about AD 250 or so. We would later find other vessels, and I'll refer back to those later on in this presentation, where we were able to push the use of chocolate or cacao back to 1000 BC. Next slide, please. This is another tomb, one of those that had been looted from this particular site called Rio Azul in this northeast corner of Guatemala. And painted on the walls are various depictions, including the stela to the far left there, which gives us certain kinds of calendar dates and identifies individuals. So we know that this was a tomb that dates to what's known as the early classic, in this case, somewhere between AD probably 350 and 500. Next slide, please. Circled on the lower right of this map, so this is a map of the city of Rio Azul, probably at its heyday at about AD 700 or so. But in the lower right, you see circled G103, and this was my particular task. This is the personal journey part of this site. This became my place to excavate. Next slide, please. And it turned out to be a large temple building, wonderful preserved plaster steps. Next slide, please. There we go. And so that's a thick coat of plaster. And it turned out that this building dates to what's known as the pre-classic period, somewhere between AD 100 and 200. Next slide. Just one of the best examples of what's known as pre-classic architecture in the Maya area. Next slide. We dug extensively down in front of the building to pretty great depths. And what you see here are this thick white layer is an intentional covering by the Maya. And below that are a series of layers of sort of gray and reddish and tan soils. So this was in preparation to build a huge temple on top of this platform. So for some reason, that site was abandoned by about AD 200, 250. This whole area is abandoned. So in that previous map, it's sort of an isolated part of the site where the rest of the site grows into these large, dramatic temples, towering temples, and so forth. This part was abandoned. Next slide. At the base of the stairs was found a cache or a special offering, had part of a human skull cap, some dog mandible fragments, and bones of puppies, as well as a shell and jade bead. This is offered as a dedication for the construction of the new building. You see some of the folks sitting on the stairs, and the stairs are painted red. Next slide. So this is what the face, this is the face of the stairs, a very deep, in a very nice red color that was still preserved here, even though this dates back to about AD 100 to 200, preserved up into recent times. Next slide. We also then, in our last season, put in a tunnel in through the building. So in outline on the right, you see that staircase where that's, you see the people standing inside of the tunnel. And it turns out that that leads into an interior building. So the Maya constructed their architecture almost like nested dolls, building over building over building. Next slide. And this was on the inside. It was a decorated facade or a decorated surface of the building on the interior. The design that you see on the right is the excavated part that we had. That's the tunneling that we see. And when you see two big J scrolls, or what are sometimes called feathers, going to each side, and in the central panel is an element that's a sideways U. It looks like a C from here, but it's a sideways U with a couple of dots. Next slide, please. And there are various, and next slide again, please. And there are various interpretations of what these things mean. These J scrolls could be wings referring to the sky band and so forth. Next slide. Whereas the U scroll, you see there to the left and the photo of it to the center in outline, can represent a number of different things, or there are different interpretations for it. This was at the time and remains one of the earliest decorated buildings in the Maya lowlands, so it's of great significance. And unfortunately, we had to move our project after this particular season. Next slide, please. That's just the outline of that design. Next slide. So we moved the project. You will see the northeast corner of Guatemala. There's Rio Azul, where we work, Quinal, this whole region. And we were invited by the Program for Belize, a sort of an NGO of sorts for the country of Belize, put together between Belizeans, the Audubon Society, and a botanical center. So this outlined region is what the University of Texas, because I'm here, we have this as our research area. It's a little bit better than 250,000 acres of land to research. A significant aspect has focused in this northern segment. These lines that you see through here are various transects, the surveys that we've done. Next slide. It is still a forested area. This is the one road that goes through the property. You can see an open area to which our camp is located next to that. But we have to survey through the forest to get to wherever we're going. So it's slow, hard, difficult work, but quite fruitful. Next slide. One of the big things about this part, this is the program for Belize Archaeological Project. This is an area of the forested where we've bushed some of the lower areas. To the right, you see a little mound going up. That's cultural. So this is a place where we take lots of UT students, field schools that we have here normally every summer. We haven't the last couple of summers because of COVID, but nonetheless, this is where a lot of students get training in terms of how to do survey and mapping and identify what are cultural features versus natural features. Next slide. These kinds of excavations where early structures are exposed. In this particular case, this structure is pre-classic, so it goes all the way back to probably about 200 or 300 BC. Next slide. We've had students help with working. That's classic period architecture that you see there. At the very top would be where there are trees in the dirt. Just below that starts the remains of the Maya houses and buildings that they had. This is a small elite structure made of stone. These are a couple of students helping to document various aspects of that. They're sitting on a very nice plaster floor. This would date somewhere between AD 700 and 800. Next slide. Here are some vessels from a tomb that was uncovered about a decade and a half ago. These happen to be earlier in time. These will date to about AD 450 to 500. Next slide, just to show some of the kinds of things we come across. And on this property, we have 5 known large centers, a couple of places that we would call cities. This is part of one called La Milpa, and those are large temples labeled there. 1, 2, 3, and 10 are large temples. Number 8 and number 9 are more like palace areas of the site. There's also a ball court here, but it just shows a city in terms of what it would look like without the forest cover and so forth in this particular version. Next slide. Exposing some of that, again, you see where the dirt is and the roots and trees would be up on top. And below that, this was work by one of our former PhD students who now works actually for National Geographic Society. So our folks go to some wonderful places, just to emphasize that, all these Texas X's. This is what we call armature. Next slide. The stuff that's left behind that's preserved. If you put plaster over that and reconstruct it, this is a reconstruction of what the top of that building would have looked like. There was a temple structure at the top, a room to enter, and you have this wonderful decorations to either side. Next slide, please. Now we're going to move to some of our, so that area and that research still continues today. We work on large cities. We work on some of the smallest of sites. So what we're interested in is we move from being a site-specific project and research group to working a region, which means we're looking at the tiniest of sites to the largest of centers. We want to understand how Maya civilization operated. How did they work? How did the small towns communicate and work between themselves as well as with the major centers that are around them? And what was involved in their subsistence? Maya civilization, the Maya society, is one, they had the full writing system, the only New World civilization to have a complete writing system in place. And they existed from at least 1000 BC to the present day. And they have certainly existed as a great civilization up until 1000 or so AD in terms of these giant buildings that were being constructed and so forth. Curious for us, where we can learn from the Maya, is how were they able to succeed and adapt for so long? What were they up to? So we hope for lessons learned there. This particular map is of another site called Kolha, also in northern Belize, also part of our research. It was part of UT research a number of decades ago. We've returned there in the last 4 or 5 years. And that's in part because you see off to the right, there's a place called Cobweb Swamp, where the main ceremonial center of the Maya is here. And I'll come back to some of this here just momentarily. Next slide, please. This is excavations close to that swamp, and in excavations that what turns out to be much earlier than identified Maya remains, going back to the Archaic, possibly the Paleo-Indian period. Next slide. So the top illustration here is a Paleo-Indian point that comes from northern Belize. Below that are what are known as low points or Archaic points, although they overlap in time. Now we know there are people in Belize from at least 10,000, 12,000 years ago coming forward. And then there's an Archaic period at about 8,000 until we get to the Maya. Next slide. These are some of the actual points that have been located. Those are those low points. These aren't so much spear points as they're probably knives used for processing various kinds of materials. Next slide. And there are also then these, what we call constricted adzes. People like to call them shoe-shaped unifaces. We'll call them constricted adzes. They're used for woodworking and so forth. So those dark points are used. There's a transition from the Paleo-Indian into the Archaic. From the Archaic, we have the earlier part of the Archaic with those dark points. By the latter part of the Archaic, we have these kinds of tools that are being used. Next slide is another example of this kind of tool. Next slide. From that, the Archaic people settle. They're already there in and around this site of Kolha, in and around Cobweb Swamp. We have their remains. We see the artifacts in place. We then have the development of Maya civilization by about 1000 BC, and some of the best Maya remains, that is Maya artifacts, are coming from this central part of the site. Next slide. Again, we dig rather deep. These are various layers. This dark zone that you see down towards the bottom, that's the earliest part that we have so far documented of the Maya remains. In other words, going back to 1000 BC. A fascinating thing that we found a few years ago is there's this thick clay down below it. In some places it's yellow, in other excavations it's red, in some places it transitions to white. So one of the things we're wanting to do is to go back and get down to this particular zone to see if those people, the earliest Maya, must have put in some kind of clay platform, and it's probably a design using these colored clays upon which they then built their villages. Next slide. And this is what the earliest villages look like, these sort of platforms upon which perishable structures were placed. Next slide. Again, there's another platform plastered over a little bit, and perishable pole and thatch buildings are on this. That clay platform is probably underneath this kind of construction. Next slide. We also get burials that occur. Next slide. And some of the artifacts include things like this. This is a little censer. It was used to burn copal. It's a two-piece. The head comes off from the rest of it, but the form and shape of what we call this little fat man, this bellied figure whose arms come around to the navel, is very reminiscent of very early stone sculpture all the way down to the Pacific coast of Guatemala. So there is communication and all kinds of things going forth. So the idea for this, though, this particular item, this artifact, that style dates to 1000 BC, far earlier than what we see down on the coast of Guatemala, executed then in stone. And so next slide, please. So with our excavations, we come across these various materials. Invariably, we will come across human remains or caches or special offerings. And knowing what we may find or what we think we sometimes hope we don't find in some cases, before we start our excavations in Guatemala, in northern Belize and so forth, we have Maya priests come in. A Maya shaman will come in to bless the excavations, to bless the research that we're doing. So all of our work is done with whatever local community is involved. And it's usually local folks that are helping us with the excavations so that we share that information and knowledge, and to make sure that everything follows a very good and positive protocol in terms of how we move forward. Next slide. Examples of the kinds of vessels that are found, sometimes with burials, sometimes as caches. Next slide. That's just another close-up of that same version. Next slide. Other kinds of artifacts at the upper right are little stone drills that are found, specifically dating back to that 800 to 1000 BC, as well as the little shell beads to the left. And in the lower left, by chance, a number of years ago, we found this, what amounts to a necklace. And these are little anthropomorphic, little human-shaped bone beads. and the little holes go from basically from ear to ear and would have been strung in a magnificent looking necklace. This kind of material tends to be specifically associated with that earliest Maya time period. Next slide. Okay. Again, this shows some of the excavations. This vessel that's here, this lower vessel, you see a little spout right there. Next slide. There's a bowl, dates back to that earliest time. Next slide. And then we get these spouted jars. These spouted jars are now today often called chocolate pots. These are vessels. We have probably a dozen or more from the site. Again, this is the kind of vessel that the residues from the inside were tested by the food chemists. Yes, they have chocolate in them. The spouts do not work as spouts as we would know them. They do not work to pour out of, because if you go to pour out of the spout, something will come out of the top of the jar before it comes out of the spout. That spout is used to either add something while something is being cooked inside, or perhaps as a means of blowing air into it to froth up the chocolate. One of the fascinating things about our findings in terms of what the chemists had to say about this, they said, yes, there's chocolate in there, which of course we reported on and so forth. What we didn't report on, and what many of my colleagues seem to miss but has continued to intrigue me, is that the food chemist said, yeah, there's chocolate in there, but there's at least another 10 or 12 other things that we can't identify that are in there, other kinds of things. So we know that the Maya used, for example, honey to sweeten the chocolate from time to time, or they would use chili peppers to spice the chocolate. There was no milk in the new world among the Maya, so milk chocolate is something introduced by the Europeans. Once chocolate was introduced to the Europeans, they added milk to it, and that's how we get milk chocolate. This is standard dark chocolate, tends to be bitter, very precious drink. It grows on trees. Cacao was used as money by the Aztecs much later in time. So there was a time when money grew on trees, as it were. Unfortunately, that's not the case for us today so much. But the Maya also had available to them cinnamon bark and vanilla vine and allspice. So there are all kinds of possible things that were mixed in with the chocolate, depending on what the chocolate was used for, whether it was being used for a medicinal product, as just a luxury beverage, as an herbal cure for something. We just don't know. Next slide. The site of Kolhab and that area becomes important because it is in a place called the chert bearing zone. And so what you're looking at in this slide, that white line across the top is actually a nice thick plaster floor. That V shape of the plaster is where there was a perishable post that had been placed in there for a building, for a small structure. That post decayed long ago, and that marl or that plaster then filled in that space. The rest of this is chert or flint debris. Next slide. Here's a close-up of it. And that is all lithic debris. There was a great workshop there. So even the smallest stuff that looks like sand is nothing but crushed chert. It's a phenomenal, that's one of the resources. In the New World, we didn't have metal to work in the ancient past. So in the ancient past, everything was stone on stone or stone on wood. So stone is a valuable resource, and there's high quality chert here, which is why Paleo-Indian and Archaic peoples before the Maya were there. Next slide. And they used the stone to chop down the forest, to burn it, to plant their crops. Next slide. And we know that the ancient Maya put in canals for what are called raised fields. And these raised fields took water away from the systems because there's a rainy season in this part of the world. And if you can drain the water away, so the canals are not needed to bring water for the crops, but rather takes water away so you can put in an additional crop in the rainy season. More crops, more food, more people, more labor. Maya civilization blossoms and grows in this particular kind of environment. Next slide. And at Kolha, we have raised fields. There where those Archaic people were, and then the Maya, we see the remnants of the canals and the fields that are left. Next slide. And they look very much like this. So they're not functioning today, but we see where they were. Next slide. just thus the different kinds of tools that are used through time. So we can tell time sometimes by the shape of the tool as well as the kind of pottery that's available. For those who want to know, how do you know it's this time or that? How do you know it's pre-classic or classic or post-classic? It's through this kind of data and information. Next slide. There was also, at the end of classic Maya civilization, although the Maya continued, a destruction of many sites across the lowlands, and then sites are then abandoned. In this particular case, there's a what's known as a skull pit. 30 individuals were decapitated, tossed into this shallow pit. There was a perishable building above this limestone platform. It was set on fire. That fire collapsed the building to the front, which is what helped to preserve the skulls. The heat of the fire shattered these limestone blocks. That's a reconstruction having that particular context. So we know what happens at the end of classic Maya civilization as they transition into the post-classic and other ways of life. Next slide. This is one of those chocolate pots. There's the cacao pod up on top, from which the chocolate is extracted. Another spouted vessel in different forms. And again, these are beginning from 1000 BC on and forward. Next slide. And one of the things that I have had the opportunity to learn with various workmen and colleagues and sort of cooks and folks that help us out in the field is the use of local materials, right? So the workmen there, when I was much younger and would be in the field doing survey with them and so forth, you know, I'd get cut with something or not feeling good one day, and inevitably they'd come forward with some kind of fruit or leaf or root or something. They'd say, oh, here, you need to taste, you know, take this, it'll work to help with that. You know, maybe it's a headache or maybe something. But of course, I quickly learned that they also have a great sense of humor and sometimes just want to see how the gringo's going to react to whatever he's willing to consume. And so this fella is Corey Toon from a village that we worked close to, and he was showing me a vine from the forest. And this vine looks just like a dead and looks like almost any other vine in the forest, but you cut it at an angle and you wait a few minutes, and then out starts to come clear, cool, perfectly fine, delicious water. So if you were ever in a forest and really thirsty, you can see a drop starting to come out of here. Really nice water comes out of this if you know what the resources might be. Next slide. And so over the years, we learned about different things. We see these trees with these hatchered marks. That's the chicle tree or gum tree. That's how chewing gum comes about. Today, it's used for commercial purposes. We've tried natural chewing gum, and it's wonderful. You can't, what we learn is how you can harvest this and when you can harvest it, and there are limitations to it and so forth. Real gum, we have synthetic gum today that we chew. For those that chew gum, it's synthetic gum. So you chew it, the flavor's gone, and the chewing gum becomes small. This chewing gum, you can chew it till the flavor's gone, and you hate to throw it away. The gum does not become smaller. It stays the same size. And so you're constantly chewing this massive chunk of chewing gum that's kind of irritating because you don't want to quite get, I never really wanted to get rid of it because it stayed whole. So anyway, next slide. We have cahoon palms, lots of different palm trees. This is the cahoon palm. It produces nuts that kind of look like a bunch of grapes. It has a nutty fruit inside, which is really delicious and great, produces a wonderful oil that's used for various kinds of, can be used for various products. The shell, though, is incredibly hard and difficult to crack and break through. It was used in World War II, turned into charcoal and used as a filter for pilot's masts and so forth, for flying and so forth. So it has lots of fabulous uses and other potential uses. Next slide. This is the allspice tree. If anybody's familiar with allspice, wonderful and fragrant. We often will bring into camp some fresh leaves. The cooks love to brew up a batch of allspice tea. It's great if something's aching in your belly and so forth, but it has a very nice and wonderful flavor to it that we use every year. It's part of what we do in terms of instructions for our students. Next slide. Okay, so we've covered a lot of territory, a lot of the area and so forth. So among my interests there, more recently, is that connection that goes from the Archaic period, the pre-Maya, to who are the earliest Maya. Our suspicions are, given the technologies and those tools given the plants and foods that are consumed through that time, that these archaic Maya become the Maya, that they are the Maya. So among the next steps that we're taking now is to follow up on tool use, to follow up on plant use, but also to follow up on ancient DNA studies. And we can now do what's known as geoDNA. So in that archaic period, we don't need to find human remains. When people die and are buried, there are little bugs, of course, that are eating flesh and parts of the bone and so forth. When those bugs die, they carry that human DNA that they've been ingesting. We can now track DNA in that way. It's a long and difficult and slow process, but it's a way to connect the people we identify as Maya to those that we identify as the archaic populations, because I think, at least, they're the same people, although we don't credit them the same. We have to have certain things in place before we identify them as Maya. The fascinating connection is that at about 3400 BC or so, these archaic people are already planting crops. They're already growing corn and beans and chili peppers. So the crops that we identify with Maya civilization are already in place when the archaic people are there. They've already done the hard work of getting to that process of domestication. So that's a fascinating component. Connected to the Maya, perhaps, is that we all remember 2012, I hope. So in 2012, the world was coming to an end according to Maya prophecies and so forth. That's not what the Maya said at all. It's that there was a count. The Maya said the world as we know it starts again at 2012. That's because there was a very long cycle that the Maya documented, that at 2012, their calendar changes, much like ours did from 1999 to 2000, and everybody claimed all of our computers were going to go blank and crazy, and the banks were going to close. We weren't going to make that transition. That same kind of thing was there for the Maya at 2012. That cycle is just over 5,000 years, is how the Maya could count back. And the Maya could count back millions of years in time. So, but that particular cycle, if we go back from 2012, that 5,000 or so years, we end up at about that 3400 BC period when we see domestication taking place, when it's the archaic. The Maya saw that as a point of origin. That's how they recorded it. So there must have been traditions or methods for them to make that. Maybe it's coincidental. I tend to think that there's something more to it than coincidence. Next slide. If there is a next slide, okay. So of course we see there's where we are, there's lots of animals, wonderful things to watch out for, lots of things to see that are great because it's still forested and very much a protected area. But our research and our goals are to connect those that are called pre-Maya with the Maya, to learn from the Maya what we can. They were incredibly successful for a very long time. And so many of those plants and things that we're looking at, we're looking to see if they're used all through time to give us clues to what may be of value and of use today. So it's not just a question of, isn't it great historically and into the past that way? We look to see what we can learn from the Maya of the past. Next slide. I think that's the last one. Yes, that's it. I love this photo. It's in a road cut because it's sort of about, for me, it's about Maya civilization. Maya civilization is the trunk of that tree, but below the surface is that complex civilization and complex cultures of the past that make that tree all possible. So it's all of that we really learn from, all these different things, whether it's geology or botany or soil science and cultural parts and the artifacts. It all comes together to make what we know of and what we tend to call Maya civilization. Okay, I'm going to cut that off there, I think, for any questions, things that I might answer or issues.
Yeah,
thank you very
much.
much.
So much. That was awesome. We do have a couple of questions coming in. I'm hearing an echo. Are you hearing an echo?
I don't hear an echo. I'm fine.
Okay, that's good. Then I'm going to move on. So a couple of people are interested in the chocolate question. So let's go back to chocolate.
Okay.
You mentioned that the chocolate vessels had lots of different ingredients in it, and maybe one of them was a sweetener or a honey. So there's a couple of questions regarding, do you think that honeybees were brought over and that they were being cultivated at that time and used in the chocolate pots, or was it some other sweetener? We're just kind of curious because our understanding was that bees weren't really native to
No,
South and North America.
Bees are native. Bees are native, very important. There's a stingless honeybee that the Maya to this day will grow. Sometimes in their gardens, in their backyards, they use hollowed out logs and they simply plug it with scob or plaster. And there's a place where bees can come and go. They'll unplug it to harvest the honey and then replug it. But we have all kinds of indications, even into the earliest of Maya times for honey being present. Yes.
Wow. Okay. We've got a couple of questions about Rio Azul. So one question was, did UT sponsor the excavations there? One question. Yeah.
So the initial excavations at UT were through UT San Antonio is where it was started. But then I came to Austin and still part of that project. So then it was a UT San Antonio, UT Austin project. So a number of our students participated in that and graduated from here using data from that site as well. And then from that part, from Rio Azul, we transitioned over to the Belize side because Program for Belize had been established. We were doing this regional, we moved from a site-specific to a regional project, and Program for Belize said, we need that kind of study on our property to understand how to better protect what we have. So we agreed. We reached a 20-year agreement. So I'm gonna date this now. So that was from 1992 when we first started. We had a 20-year agreement that would go to 2012 of all years. But by 1994, we were already determined to put in more effort, and we started put some of our research and some of our resources into a more permanent camp and renegotiated an additional 20 years. So we have the property permission to be there doing research on that 250,000 acres through 2032 if we so choose. That can be renewed down the line, but for now we're good until 2032 in terms of what archaeology is done on that property and who's involved in it. So UT still leads that research, we do, but we also have another 6 or 7 institutions from across the country that join us. So while we have the lead, we have collaboration from many different places across the country and abroad.
You answered the second question there. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, sorry.
So we've got some questions coming in. I'm just going to read these verbatim. Are there any plans to use ground penetration radar to map the area? And for the buildings like the Russian dolls that were built on top of each other, were they built that way deliberately or had layers been added over time? Okay. Does that make sense?
All right. So yes. So answer the first one. So the ground penetrating radar, yes, we do some of that to look for specific features that are underneath plazas and so forth, because there are earlier buildings there. More recently, we've used what's called LiDAR over a significant patch. And there's another part that we were supposed to do this last year, but because of COVID, we couldn't. That'll be done this next spring. And that penetrates through the forest cover and really produces maps for us in many ways. We then ground proof them, but we can see towns, villages, cities, walls, ball courts, all kinds of things through the forest that we hadn't been able to, let's say 10, 15 years ago. So it's a phenomenal development in technology. And archaeology, we're kind of on the back end of getting that. We can't afford that technology ourselves. It's usually somebody that comes up with it and wants to put it to a test. And of course we say, well, let's try it. And we get all kinds of great stuff from that. In terms of the nested buildings, that's a very long tradition. And part of that is because it's a smart way to build. It saves time, energy, and materials, resources. If you already have a platform or a small mounded structure, it's easier to cover that with a layer and build on top. You get a larger structure and a much taller building very quickly, rather than starting from scratch and having to build the whole core of the structure themselves. These buildings are not hollow. So on top, of the top platform, that flat layer, is where you would have sort of rooms that are constructed upon which people are moving in and out of, or living in and out of, etc. So those basic, the base of those are always built one on the other, which is why getting to the earliest buildings is often so difficult. You have to go through all of those different layers, which is the case at Rio Azul. The building that I happened to work on, we were fortunate. It was abandoned after that pre-classic period, which is why we hit the pre-classic right away. At Colha, in the plaza, the Maya built out away from the plaza to construct their larger buildings. So the earliest village is preserved within a meter or two, within 3 or 4 feet of the ground surface. So we can get to it much more quickly. That's why those are ideal places to work at this time.
And speaking of that abandoned building, do you have any idea why it was abandoned? Do you have any theories?
In the case of the one at Rio Azul, what I figured out was that the way it was covered, at first we thought was covered to become basically a no person's land, right, to hide it. But the reality is the formula that was used to cover that building is the same that we see in other places across the site upon which big temples were built. So we think what really happened was there was a political shift in rulership, in power. Whoever was in power would have been at this G103, that building where I had excavated. Then a few hundred meters away, where the big buildings really take off, there happened to be a looter's trench, and we found in there some altars, some small molded altars with plaster, and there are individuals there that date to that same time period. There are individuals there who were bound. They look like captives. It looks like they may be scalped. Their tops of their heads are being removed. It looks like blood coming out. They are naked. They've been disrobed. And of course, their hands bound behind them. So we think that was a display of the powers that were there. Somebody else comes into Rio Azul, they take over the place in essence, or some other family gains power, and they simply refuse to build in this part of the site. Another part of the site develops, that part of town develops, this other part becomes a no man's land in many respects. You're just not allowed to go there.
So when you refer to pre-Maya or archaic Maya, is there a separate distinction from the Olmec, or is there an event that defines pre-Maya versus Maya in that transition?
So the Olmec are another cultural group over on the Gulf Coast, right? They overlap with the earliest Maya. Perhaps they overlap the end of the Archaic in terms of time. In the Olmec area, they've already got settled villages and starting to construct and build. They're moving towards their civilization in that sense. In the Maya area, there wasn't quite that push or need, right? That didn't develop at that particular time. And I'm going to come back to a separate little point there in a minute. So that's why I think that the Archaic people are the Maya. They very quickly become that in terms of the more settled villages and expand. They already have everything in place. Maybe the Olmec stimulus helped them to move in that direction. I don't know. That's a possibility. They would have been in contact with each other because we find bits of jade that look like what we would call Olmec jade, even though jades come from the highlands. They come from a completely different place. So people are in communication in a very big and broad way. Now, one of the fascinating things about that for me personally is, for a while, I took a great interest in what's called the Huastec. The Huastec are a group up in northeast Mexico, up above Veracruz and Tamaulipas, in that area. And the Huastec are a fascinating group. They're still there today. There are these people they call Tannic-speaking peoples that are there, the Huastec. And they're there for a very long period of time. It turns out that the Tannic, these Huastec, these Tannic-speaking people, Tannic is a Maya language. The Huastecs are actually a Maya group that somehow ends up in northeast Mexico, and their point of origin, according to linguists, was probably 2,000 or 3,000 years ago out of the highlands of Guatemala. That language is now extinct in Guatemala, but exists in northeast Mexico, and they're connected. My guess is that the Maya where they exist across Guatemala and Belize and Yucatan, are probably the Olmec and continued all up the coast, all the way up. And those are the Maya speakers that are left. And there was all this communication. It's later groups, later peoples in time that sever those connections. And then we separate the Olmec from the Washtec, and we separate the Olmec from the Maya. That's just guesswork on my part. That's an educated guess to a certain extent. I have no proof for that. I go round and round with linguists trying to get them to be more committed, but they always say, well, there's this possibility and that possibility and so forth. So, but there are various reasons for why thinking that they really are connected. I think they are to a great extent the same people. The developments just come about at different times for different reasons. There are different needs, and that's how people adapt. We don't all take on the same attributes and needs or requirements at the same time. They may be available, but we may decide we don't need them just yet.
Okay. Well, I kind of want to turn to some cultural questions. And you mentioned in your lecture that at the time, there was a lot of communication between the different geographical areas and different cultures. So can you tell us a little bit about how they did that? Was there trade between these different organizations? How did they do that? You mentioned that cacao was money at that time, and can you just go into a little bit more depth in those areas?
Sure, I'll try. So,
okay.
In terms of, so trade and exchange is communication that's existed for a very, very, very long time. And we know that because we find items that are from great distances in a local setting, for example. The question is, was that traded directly from point A to what is point B, or was it traded down the line? It goes from this village to this village to this village, and it ends up here where we find it. So that part can be more difficult to find. My thought is things are traded down the line, whether it's greenstone or jades, whether it's obsidian, whether it's chert, whether it's cacao, whatever it might be. So the communication that's involved, and we have to think about this as the general area of Mesoamerica, when we're talking about the Maya, and then perhaps over in Oaxaca, the Zapotecs, and then in central Mexico, the Toltecs or the Aztecs or whoever may be involved. These are international relations. So there are people, this is complex, it's just like today, it's complex societies, complex civilization. There would have been people that could speak 2 or 3 languages or dialects of a language to facilitate communication. There would have been people that were economically involved, moving things from one place to another, as long as it's viable to do so. Remember that there are no pack animals in the New World. If something is moved, it's either moved on a boat or canoe or raft, down a waterway, or it's on a person's back. That's the only way to move things around. And so there are certain things that can't be moved long distances. It has to go from place to place to place. What we tend to see over time where there is evidence is that people that fall between groups tend to take on characteristics from both ends. So we know, for example, late in the Maya, because of artwork and other materials, in that post-classic period, let's say at about AD 1000 to 1200 or 1300 or so, there are Maya that are considered Maya traders, right? Economic traders and so forth. And so biologically, they are Maya. They look like Maya when you see them in portraits. But the dress and the garb that they wear, sandals or other coverings, look more Mexican. They look like more from central Mexico. So they're what we call the Mexicanized Maya or economic traders. So they are probably the middle people between the rest of the Maya and the central Mexican groups, and trading and moving materials back and forth in that sense. So we do see that over time. For cacao, for chocolate, we know it's a valuable commodity. We were able to push that date back to 1000 BC among the Maya. A former graduate student of ours who was working with us then went to work with somebody in the Olmec area and pushed the use of cacao back even further. They're now working with groups in South America, have a request, just got a request last week to use some of this same cacao, the residues that we have. with that from South America because they're now trying to do a DNA between the cacao to see how the cacaos are related, how's chocolate related from South America to Central America and so forth. By the time the Aztecs are in place and the Spanish come into place, that's when we see cacao being used as money. And it's being, so the Aztecs come down and conquer parts of the Chiapas and Guatemala coast, an area known as the Soconusco, because it's a significant cacao producing area. They wanted that chocolate. And that chocolate would be, those pods that you saw would be packed in big baskets and nets and hauled all the way to central Mexico as an elite beverage in essence, and for medicinal purposes. That's where we see some of the first counterfeiting of money. What would happen is those that collected it along the way, somebody might break a cacao pod open, scoop out the meat and the good stuff inside, repack it with mud and seal it and put it in the middle of that net full of cacao pods and send it on its way. Of course, that was illegal, just like counterfeiting is illegal today. But at that time, it was punishable by death. So if you were caught counterfeiting cacao, you would be put to death in various ways and so forth. So, but yes, we see materials that trade and are moved along, and some things that become precious. The further from the resource, from where it's found, the more valuable it tends to become. Not unlike many things today.
And you had mentioned all kinds of roles for people. Were there any other roles that were important that this group should know? So we've talked about trade, we've talked about cultivation, but you know, societal roles. Can you go into any details there? Sorry about that.
Sure, no, that's fine. Sorry, I get carried away and just keep talking. So, generally speaking, most people tend to divide the Maya case into two significant groups, sort of the elite and the commoners. And the reality is there are a number of grades in between. There are people that are in between that and so forth. Not quite to the extent that we would see today, that there would be, you know, a few people at the very top, the ruling families, but be aware that just like today, a ruling family has competing families that could also be ruling families. And so what tends to happen and what you can see is disputes and wars that may come up, battles for power, as it were. Our particular interest tends to focus more on what we call that commoner population. Most of the small sites, we can get a lot more information about what people were up to, what their behavior was in the past, what they had access to, how they interacted at that level, rather than those big cities. We sort of know a fair amount about those. And the reality is Maya civilization would not be possible without that mass of without that 90% of the population, right? Elites rarely account for more than 3 or 4% of any given population. It's that other 90+% that really makes Maya civilization possible. But those few at the top have a difficult task, not unlike today, to try to remain popular, to try to keep their power in various ways. And so we suspect that there's a lot of interaction and things that take place back and forth. And I have my suspicions about what takes place. You know, in the big cities, we see big rituals by the rulers, by the priests, by the scribes and so forth, of recording things. But all things that are recorded, even if they're carved on stone, historical documents tend to have some propaganda to them. So historical documents, like all things, you have to ask, who is this written for? Who is this monument really carved for? And what are they trying to accomplish? Is this event true? Or are they fabricating something or making it something grander than it is? My suspicions are that a lot of the rituals that the elite engaged in, even though they're larger and more magnificent, are mimicking the kinds of rituals and things that people were having in their smaller towns and perhaps even in their homes as a way of connecting with the common folk, right, and keeping that popularity there.
All right, I think we have time for 2 more questions. The first one is, in general, what happened to the human remains? How did they bury them? What did they do with them? Those sorts of things.
That varies from time period and location, and it depends on who the person was. If the person was a captive, sometimes the individuals are completely burned and cremated, almost completely cremated. Rarely do we get a complete cremation. In a lot of cases, they're buried either extended or flexed. It depends on the time period and who they were. Some people are in simple burials. Others have elaborate tombs to them. Some have crypts, something in between. So that tends to vary according to who was the person and the time that that happened to have taken place. In other cases, parts of people are removed and taken to another location and buried at the new location to sort of legitimize an ownership of property or a place because your ancestors are now buried there. So in the Maya case, as happens in places across Latin America today, sometimes an image of something is used to represent the whole thing. You don't need the entire person. Sometimes just a long bone or a jaw might represent that entire person or the need that's represented.
Okay, and then this is a question, I'm just going to read this verbatim. So we know that robbing contemporary graves is wrong. Is there an accepted age in archaeology where it was considered acceptable to enter a grave?
I don't think so. I think in terms of archaeological research, most that I'm aware of, most graves or tombs or crypts that are often found are usually I don't know of an archaeologist that goes out to dig for human remains. That's just that would be a difficult task at a number of different levels. The problem is we may come across human remains in excavating the structure because we don't always know where the Maya, in the case of the Maya, where they might have placed somebody. When we do that, then there's a question of what do we do to best preserve those remains. In some cases, if it's right on, and we know that's the case, and it's not something that we're interested in at all at the time, they will be simply covered up and reburied. If we can have somebody come in and assist with that, that's what we will do. We always have people that work specifically with human remains on the project so that things are documented properly if they need to be removed.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Valdez, for joining us for our September lunchtime lecture. We really enjoyed listening to you, and we appreciate your time. And thanks to everyone that joined us today. We have continued to participate in our virtual events throughout the year. We love being able to connect virtually with y'all, and we hope that you keep coming back and back. We would love to see you again for our October and November events. Dr. Sean Theriot from the Department of Government will be joining us on Wednesday, October 13th, to break down the current status of American politics with an eye towards the 2022 midterm elections. And Dr. Adam Rabinitz would be discussing Planet Texas 2020 initiatives on Wednesday, November 17th. So again, thank you very much, Dr. Valdez, and thank you everyone for attending today. And we hope you have a good week. We'll see you soon.
Thank you all very much.